The last thing my mother said to me before my sister's engagement party wasn't hello. It was Astra. Stay out of the family photos. You ruin the mood. She didn't whisper it out of anger. She said it calmly, like it was the most natural truth in the world, while adjusting my collar as if I were an inconvenience she needed to tidy up before the guests arrived. In that moment, something inside me cracked so quietly no one noticed, but deep enough that I did. I stood there, watching her walk away, realizing she hadn't just excluded me from the pictures. She'd excluded me from the family a long time ago. My name is Astra Leorin. And that was the night everything finally broke open. I landed in Santa Fe, carrying the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from miles or altitude, but from knowing exactly how the night would unfold. The moment I stepped into the venue, it was clear no one had been waiting for me. A few polite nods drifted my way thin. Practiced gestures meant for acquaintances, not family. I moved through the lobby without slowing, letting the noise of the party wash over me like static. Near the photo backdrop, my aunt was fussing over my sister's posture, tilting her chin into the warm light. The second I approached, her expression tightened. She shifted her body just enough to block space beside them and murmured for me to step back so the color palette wouldn't be thrown off. I paused only a breath before turning away. Silence had always served me better than protest. Years spent beneath concrete ceilings and coded lights had trained me well in that. The reception hall stretched out like a map divided by invisible lines. The main tables glittered under chandeliers. Mine sat near the service doors, where waitstaff slipped in and out without looking up. I lowered myself into the chair, pretending not to notice how deliberately the distance had been drawn. From where I sat, I could see my reflection faintly in the window, familiar, but distant in a way I couldn't quite name. I let out a slow breath and reminded myself why I'd come. Tonight wasn't about blending in or being tolerated. Tonight, I intended to end the pattern that had followed me for decades. On my way toward the bar, I passed the VIP section. Mason Hale looked up mid-conversation, and for a single suspended second, his eyes locked on mine. Not with confusion or recognition of a stranger, but with the sharp, startled focus of someone remembering a voice he shouldn't be hearing in a place like this. My life has always existed in two separate worlds that refused to touch, in one. I was the forgettable daughter who rarely appeared in family stories. Someone relatives described in vague tones because they never truly knew anything about me. In the other, I lived beneath layers of reinforced concrete in Colorado, tucked away in a windowless zone where phones didn't work and days blurred into mission cycles. Moving between those worlds felt unnatural, like stepping from silence into noise without warning. People here never questioned why I vanished during holidays or why I avoided social media entirely. To them, it was just proof that I was distant by nature, someone who didn't try hard enough to fit in. They didn't know that nearly everything about my work required discretion, my schedule, my absence, my silence. They didn't know the operations I oversaw would never be acknowledged publicly, or that every successful mission ended with the same instruction: forget what you did and return as if nothing happened. Years ago, there was a night when a SEAL team was minutes away from being overrun. Their comms were fractured, the terrain against them, the odds miserable. I approved a tactical shift at the last possible second, buying them the escape route they needed. The team leader survived with wounds that would have ended someone else. His name was Mason Hale. Seeing him now stirred a faint echo of that night, the clipped radio transmissions, the sudden hush when the gunfire stopped. But rules governed my entire career. No names, no recognition, no identifying myself outside secure walls. Whatever connection existed between us had to remain invisible. As voices and laughter mixed around me, my fingers brushed the faint line on my wrist where an ID band used to rest day and night. A server glanced at the movement, probably assuming I worked venue security, and hurried past. I let the moment slip, settling back into the anonymity this room insisted on giving me. I had never felt lonely underground, surrounded by screens and silence, but here, surrounded by people who share my last name, I felt myself fading more with every minute. Santa Fe looked almost theatrical under soft amber lights. The adobe walls glowed, The guitarist near the courtyard played something warm and slow, and the smell of roasted chilies drifted in from outside. It could have been a perfect evening if not for the constant reminders of where I stood in this family. Someone pointed me toward a seat near the service doors to avoid crowding the main table. Another jokingly wondered if I'd been fixing government printers all week, earning a round of polite laughter. Then came the final sting. Delivered so lightly, it almost passed as helpful, keep me away from the official engagement photos because the palette needed to stay bright. I stayed quiet. But inside, something shifted. I could feel the divide more sharply than ever, one foot anchored in discipline and classified routines, the other forced into a space where I was treated like an unwelcome guest. Belonging felt impossible in either direction. At the bar, I asked the bartender to start a fresh batch. Telling him we were out of time on the current one, the phrase slipped from my mouth before I could stop it. Mason, standing a few paces away, froze. His glass tilted dangerously, and the look on his face carried a recognition I didn't want to see. I turned before he could speak. A cousin intercepted me with a microphone, inviting me to share a few words as the resident federal tech employee. The crowd chuckled. Mason didn't. His expression had gone pale. The kind of pale that belongs to someone remembering a moment that shouldn't follow him into a room like this. I returned to the side table, hoping the shadows near the service doors would soften the tightness growing in my chest. The laughter from the center of the room grew sharper, thinner, almost metallic. Santa Fe's brand of politeness was its own kind of cruelty, warm on the surface, cold the moment you stepped outside the circle. Faces glowed under the yellow lights. Glasses lifted in perfect rhythm, and no one had the faintest idea I was scanning the room with the same instinct I used in briefings, tracking tone shifts, watching posture, predicting outcomes. It didn't take long to notice Mason staring again, not in the way a groom admires guests, but like a man trying to place where he'd heard a sound before. His gaze followed me with attention that didn't belong to a celebration. I rolled the condensation around my glass and pretended not to see him falter. That look wide, searching, unsettled was one I had seen in many operators right after an extraction. When adrenaline stopped masking the truth, when I handed my empty glass to a passing server, I told him to be careful because someone behind him was carrying a heavy tray. The words slipped out of my mouth on reflex. "Watch your six." Mason stiffened as if I'd detonated something directly behind him. His shoulders jerked. The stem of his drink knocked against his cuff. I didn't need to hear him speak to know exactly which memory had just resurfaced. I walked away, but a suited man stepped into my path, one of Mason's teammates. A small pin on his lapel caught the light. His eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second before he drifted back toward Mason, muttering just loud enough for me to catch the edges of his doubt. He thought I sounded like someone from a Red Meridian briefing. I kept my expression still, but my pulse slowed into the careful rhythm I used during tense comms. I took 3 steps toward the exit. Mason shifted as if pulled by instinct, nearly spilling his drink. The droplets hit his wrist, but he didn't flinch. His eyes tracked me like a man realizing the person he was recognizing shouldn't exist in this setting. In that moment, I knew the silence I had preserved for years was sliding toward its breaking point. A SEAL never forgets the voice that guides them out of a kill zone, and my family, blissfully unaware, carried on as if tonight was nothing but a stage for their own social sparkle. My name drifted across the speakers before I had time to brace myself. My mother stood at the front with a microphone, smiling the bright, polished smile she reserved for people she wanted to impress. She motioned for attention, and the room quieted just enough for her to paint me into a corner. She introduced me as her eldest, the one who handled little government tech tasks, assuring the crowd I was the go-to person if anything malfunctioned, especially the Wi-Fi. Laughter fluttered through the guests, soft enough to pass as harmless, but sharp enough to sting. I stood still, letting the humiliation settle like an unwelcome hand on my shoulder. Then a cousin lifted his phone and called out from his table, asking if I could check why his live stream kept freezing. More laughter. The sound rippled outward, bouncing off the adobe walls like a slow-rolling insult. From the edge of the room, Mason had stepped back, his face drained of color, as if the air had just been pulled from his lungs. His jaw locked, the muscles in his face tightening in an effort to remain composed. I recognized the strain immediately. A SEAL can endure chaos, fear, and pain, but watching a superior officer get mocked in public. That was a different kind of shock entirely, one that left no room to breathe. A CLBN near the stage noticed Mason's posture before anyone else. His brows tightened, and he lowered his glass with a silent understanding. Something in the room had shifted, and he could feel the tension gathering like a storm front. Then my sister bounded onto the small platform, glowing with excitement, eager to keep the energy high. She joked that I was always too serious, reassuring everyone that my work wasn't dangerous at all. The crowd roared with laughter once more. I looked at Mason. His expression had solidified into something unmovable, shoulders squared, breath measured. A man trying desperately full not to react the way his training demanded. One more inch, one more insult, and the truth I had kept buried would crack through the surface. As the laughter swelled again, Mason set his drink down slowly, inhaling like someone preparing for a command he never expected to give in a place like this. Another SEAL across the room caught the shift and gave him a barely perceptible nod. The air grew heavy, the room drew still, and I felt it the countdown to everything I had tried to keep hidden finally reaching zero. When I stepped off the stage, the laughter didn't fade so much as it warped. The tone shifted less mocking, more uneasy, as if people suddenly sensed a shape behind the curtain they hadn't noticed before. A few guests watched me with narrowed eyes, their expressions no longer dismissive but puzzled, like they were trying to place me in a memory they weren't sure belonged to them. That was the first sign the night was turning. I reached the side table for a glass of water, only to hear a clipped, metallic ma'am behind me. The sound hit the air with the unmistakable edge of military reflex. Mason stood a few feet away, color draining from his face the moment he realized what he'd said. A relative glanced between us, confused why he sounded like someone receiving orders. Mason dropped his gaze instantly, as if resetting himself from a protocol breach he couldn't explain. Before the tension could settle, one of his teammates drifted over. His voice stayed low. But I caught enough. He was questioning Mason's stare, asking why he kept looking at me like I'd stepped out of a command center. Mason swallowed hard and admitted he thought that might be exactly the case. The air tightened another inch. A retired soldier near the buffet studied me openly. His eyes traced my posture, my stance, the way I scanned the room. Then he whispered to his wife that I wasn't who the family thought I was, that he'd seen my expression on leaders, not observers. His words slipped across the tables like a small but growing current. My sister appeared suddenly, grabbing my arm with a frantic whisper. She begged me not to stress Mason, insisting he was overwhelmed and needed space. I almost laughed at the misunderstanding. Mason wasn't shaken because of me. He was shaken because, piece by piece, he was recognizing something he never expected to find here. As I walked beneath the warm yellow lights, Mason stepped aside sharply. Not in avoidance, but in reflex, one trained only into subordinates. My family saw it as discomfort. I saw it for what it was, the cracks widening, the pressure building. Everything that had been contained for years was now trembling on the edge of exposure. It happened when I least expected it. I was near the bar when a relative barked out a loud insult about me, calling me useless and always had been. The word hit like a familiar bruise, but I barely reacted. The person who did was Mason. His glass shattered against the floor. Cutting through the music and chatter, he shot upright, spine locked, shoulders pulled back in a rigid, unmistakable stance. Confusion swept the room, but I recognized it instantly, the posture of a soldier sensing rank. 3 other SEALs froze, watching him. Then me. The guitar fell silent. Even the sealed BN near the buffet lowered his drink with a reverence that didn't belong in an engagement party. Then Mason turned fully toward me, breath shaking, and unleashed the command that split the night apart: flag officer on deck. The room stopped breathing. Conversations died mid-sentence. A child dropped his cupcake. 2 off-duty servicemen near the entrance snapped to attention. Every eye swung toward me, bewildered, frightened, trying to make sense of the impossible. Mason's voice cracked as he held the salute, insisting he never knew. My family stood frozen, their certainty collapsing as fast as the quiet spread. And I understood, in that heavy silence, that nothing about this night or our relationship could ever return to the way it was. When Mason's voice cut through the room, everything froze. The noise, the laughter, even the music, all of it collapsed into a heavy, breathless stillness. It wasn't the quiet of anticipation. It was the stunned silence that follows an order civilians were never meant to hear. Faces turned toward me in slow motion, confusion giving way to something like fear. I stood where they had pushed me aside earlier, letting a steady breath fill my lungs the way I once did when a drone feed vanished over hostile ground. One by one, bodies snapped into position. 3 SEALs straightened instantly. 2 veterans near the buffet rose with automatic precision. A reservist followed a beat later, and civilians scrambled upright, terrified of appearing disrespectful. In moments, the engagement party looked like a formation. None of them knew the truth. They were responding to a flag officer. I raised my hand, not to Mason, but toward the family who had spent years shrinking me, as you were. My voice dropped into the center of the room, and nobody dared move. My mother stared as if seeing a ghost she had lived with her whole life. Mason tried to speak, trembling. I stopped him gently. He had reacted exactly as he was trained. My mother reached for me, whispering questions she should have asked long ago. I stepped back, and the entire room flinched. I didn't shout. I didn't break. I simply stood in the rank they had mocked without knowing, and let the truth finish what they had started. My mother reached me first, rushing in with the frantic energy of someone desperate to rewrite the last hour. She stretched her arms as if claiming a prize. Breathless as she insisted she would have acted differently, supported me, celebrated me if only she had known. I lifted my hand and stopped her before she could touch me. Not now. The room shifted with that single refusal, dozens of eyes snapping toward us, struggling to keep up with the reversed gravity of the moment. I spoke plainly, the way I had been trained when every word mattered. Tonight exposed my military identity in a civilian setting. Under federal security protocol, I am now required to limit contact with any civilian relatives if the risk of further exposure remains. No one blinked. It was as if the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. They stared at me like I had stepped out of another universe. Mason approached carefully, posture rigid, voice trembling as he asked for guidance. He worried he had violated fraternization rules by not knowing who I truly was. I stopped him softly, reminding him he wasn't under my command. My sister cried at the sound of him addressing me like a superior in the middle of her celebration. Around us, relatives scrambled to pivot mockery, turning into admiration within seconds. They whispered about my position, my rank, the doors they assumed it could open. An aunt who once pushed me out of photos now reached excitedly for a selfie. I stepped away before she touched me. I looked at them, my mother, my sister, the people who had never understood me, and let the truth settle. I've protected them for years, but protection was never permission to treat me as invisible. Tonight, the truth finally had a voice. A year later, the shape of my life had settled into something steady, something finally my own. My apartment overlooked the Potomac, the water moving with a calm persistence that felt almost like companionship. Most mornings began with the thrum of helicopters crossing the DC skyline, a sound that grounded me far more than any family gathering ever had. I lived without their calls, their expectations, their commentary. And it wasn't anger that kept me away. It was the realization that peace sometimes requires silence, and distance is the only boundary that truly holds. One crisp afternoon, a thick cream envelope appeared in my mailbox. My sister's handwriting curled across the front, soft and hopeful. Inside was a redesigned wedding invitation, different colors, different venue, different energy. Something more subdued, less performative. She and Mason looked calmer in the new photos, as if the year had taught them something too. I sat with the invitation for a long moment, letting memories rise and fall without bitterness. I chose a small gift, nothing extravagant, but intentional, and slipped it into a package, on the RSVP. I wrote a single line, unable to attend due to operational duty. No accusation, no apology, just the truth, pared down to its simplest form. That night, I stood at my window as the lights along the Arlington Bridge flickered on. Scattering gold across the water, I felt a quiet conviction settle into me. I didn't need them to understand who I was or why things unfolded the way they did. Understanding had never been the point. All I needed was for everyone, myself included, to remain in the place the truth had finally drawn. And in that stillness, I felt a kind of peace I had spent a lifetime trying to earn.